there! It's me, Gale, and you probably thought this wasn't a series anymore because it's been months. And I don't blame you, but it turns out when you're planning a wedding, you don't have time to read. So anyway, I finally had time after my nuptials to finally read Uprooted by Naomi Novick. By Naomi Novick. And now I'm going to give you my honest thoughts and opinions on this book, because that's what you wanted. You wanted to be told how good this book is by a chick in a very comfy room wearing a Jack Skellington onesie. No one asked for this, but we all know this is what you secretly wanted. If you're unfamiliar, or if this is your first book review, then I will inform you that there are two parts to this video. The first part, up until about this time frame, is the non-spoiler section. We're gonna go through the book in just a generic fashion and just tell you the basics of, is it a good story, writing, concepts, romance, all that good stuff. After that, we get to the spoiler section, where I get to talk about all those juicy character arcs and plot points and anything else that I really feel the need to really just sink my teeth into and describe in visceral detail. So, let's dive into Naomi Novick's Uprooted. So Uprooted follows a story that is strangely familiar to me because it is a story that is really popular in fan fiction. And if you haven't noticed, I read a lot of fan fiction. It's the generic plot of a typical fairy tale setting where the local village that has no prospects really, down on its luck in some way, shape, or form, has to send off their eligible young ladies to some sort of higher power. Either like a sacrifice to a volcano, which turns out to be a god, or sacrifice to a monster who happens to be a god, or some sacrifice to a wizard, in this case, who is not God, but has the powers of God, so not a big difference. And as these plots go, usually the girl who goes has some sort of quirk, something unique that makes it so unlike the previous hundreds to thousands to maybe millions of girls who've been sacrificed to this being before. She stands out, and therefore they start a romance. And that's usually the plot, is focused on that romance and building it up, and oh, he's not as bad as he seems, or oh, he's misunderstood, dark secrets, yada yada yada. Fairy tale plot. Uprooted follows that premise pretty well for the first couple chapters. Its protagonist, Agnieszka. Pronunciations in the back of the book. So our protagonist, Agnieszka, who from now on shall be referred to as Angie because my stupid uncultured tongue cannot pronounce that name for more than 3 seconds. Poor Angie is picked in this book, and the story follows that in this plot, she is the unlucky winner when she thought, and everybody else in her village thought, that her best friend, Kasia, was going to be picked because she was the perfect girl. Perfect abilities, she was beautiful, all the traits that you would associate with someone who was going to be sacrificed to an elder being. Angie gets picked instead. She's not prepared for it at all, and so she becomes the sacrifice to the dragon, who is not a dragon, but is a wizard, because he has the nickname the dragon for reasons. I'm not sure, they don't really explain in the book, they just say that they get cool nicknames. All the wizards do. So, he's a wizard. He gets a cool nickname, he's called a dragon, he takes in young women, and he holds them for 10 years in his tower, and then at the end of 10 years they come back, and usually they are dressed lavishly, they get a whole bunch of gifts, and they all go, you know what? It kind of sucks to live here because there's a deadly forest that keeps trying to absorb us and gives us this madness, which makes us want to kill our friends and family. Oh yeah, that thing is a big part of the book. This forest that they all live next to that constantly is out for blood, trying to kill them, and if it's not trying to kill them, it is kidnapping them and then resending the kidnapped victims back into the village to be kind of like secret assassins, and they go crazy, try to murder people, drag them into the forest, all that kind of good stuff. So we got these two parts at play, and Angie is now at the wizard's tower, and the story follows her as she learns about the dragon and her adventures as the plot it starts off where you think it's gonna start off, and then like 5 chapters in, it takes a sharp left turn, and Angie gets separated from the dragon, who was supposedly our like second main protagonist of the story, and she doesn't interact with him until towards the very end of the book. Like the 3rd act climax, they finally interact with each other again, and you don't get like side views into his perspective. It's 100% just Angie for the middle of it, and her friend Kazia, and then new people that you meet. Which kind of makes this plot interesting, but also a bit cluttered, because you are in this space where you're expecting something. It is a very, I don't want to say generic. Generic's a bad term for everything that could be boring. But it is a plot hook that does lead you to certain conclusions. That being how the romance is going to develop, and how the dragon's not going to end up being as bad as everybody says he is, and how she's going to be super special in some way. And it does follow those conventions and does what you expect it to, but it does take this huge detour where a whole secondary plot kind of rushes in, and it's no longer about the whole village sacrifice thing. That's old news. We've dealt with that by the 5th chapter. It's explained mostly. There's one little mystery left to figure it out, but all of it's mostly explained. Why he chose her, why he's in this tower, who he is, what he does for 10 years. All that kind of stuff gets explained. And then they hit the middle part where Angie meets new characters, and they go and they deal with that forest. And the forest becomes the main antagonist for the rest of the story. So they fight this forest, and all this kind of stuff happens around fighting the forest, and Angie being special, and all this kind of stuff. But basically what I'm trying to say with all this babbling and rabbling is that, this story takes a left turn, and it doesn't ever come back to that original premise and really solidify what you feel you're going to get from it, which, maybe for you is a good thing. Maybe that premise didn't hit you too, strongly, and you were like, okay, this sounds a little stupid, I wish there was more action, more intrigue or something with this, and then hearing that, hey, there's this evil malevolent, what a word, this evil, malicious forest, which has some magical, spiritual, something going on with it that is attacking townspeople. Maybe that's more up your alley, and you're like, great, that's a great start to a premise, but I'm glad that there's some meat in the middle that I'm more interested in. So I can see that going both ways, being a good and a bad, but for me, it kind of just felt like 2 different stories were trying to be told, and they melded fine, but not perfectly. Not enough that I would complain about it as a serious detriment to the story, but also enough where I feel like the 2 parts coexist together and can't exist without one another, without also seeming very bare bones and empty. So it's that weird mix of being just close to being cohesive while not being fully there. Some other points about the book is I've mentioned very briefly that there is magic in this book, and there's a whole magic system, but it's not a hard magic system, it's a soft magic system, which, if you don't know the difference, one means there's strict rules and regulations on how you use it, and the other is kind of more whimsical and just, oh, magic is a thing kind of feeling. It's funny, but this book kind of deals with that difference. The dragon is a very hard magic system kind of person, and his views on magic are very strict and on those rules, whereas Angie's view on magic ends up being more soft magic side. And they battle over that, and that's a clash in their personalities that helps them grow and bond and all that romance, fluffy stuff. But the magic itself is a mix between the two. Sometimes it has a soft magic elements where it is more touchy-feely, just being in the moment, and other times it is very strict, where you have to get words exactly right and pronunciation and steps and spells. And I really liked that concept of the battle between the two types of magical thought. Like, magic is so expansive, you can have, like, science versions of magic versus, like, faith magic, kind of like a Fire Emblem situation. But it kind of feels like this book just doesn't dive deep enough into describing its magic in order for that to really be something super interesting. Like, the hard magic, we get told there's rules, but we're never explained those rules, so we never know why our main character is breaking those rules when she does use more of that soft magic sort of system. It's very tough to see how she's special in that way, or anyone else's magic is special, when we don't know what the basic rules for the magic to begin with were. Which is kind of a lost opportunity, because it really is a cool concept for them to be battling and both be good wizards, but they have two very different expressions of magic. They very much differ on their craft. But again, yeah, it's just that you don't get enough rules or reference for why one magic is the way it is versus another, and they kind of just go with it. It's just, that's how magic is. But otherwise, the magic is fun and pretty imaginative. It's not the most, out there, oh my gosh, what an amazing spectacle of magic I've read. It doesn't do anything that's, super riveting and vivid in imagery, but it doesn't do anything super boring as well. The last two things I think I want to touch on in this non-spoiler section is the characters and the romance. Because obviously I have to talk about a romance. I'm freaking FallenGale. A good quarter of my channel is dedicated to otome games. The romance sucked. Not going to sugarcoat it. The romance is awful. It barely exists to begin with. The guy's like a bajillion years older than the girl, and it shows. It's not one of those, oh, he's just a young man, like an Edward Cullen situation where he acts like a teenager, so it's believable that they'd be, together, even though, when you think about it too hard, it becomes really, really creepy. It's not like that. It's very much, this guy has been alive for, 200, 400 years, and has had previous love affairs and connections, and he's, had this whole life and maturity and, knows what he wants and all this kind of stuff. And she's, 16, 18, I don't remember her exact age, but she just turned something and got taken in against her will. And now she learns magic. And it's kind of and that's not a great basis for any romance. That's not a great basis for just any relationship in general. But, in this fairy tale, you give some leniency to it, but it just doesn't do enough fluff with the relationship to really earn that leniency. It's just, they kind of talk a little bit, he teaches her some things, she does some other outrageous things, and he's like, wow, how special, I never would have thought that someone would do this, but you totally would, because you're you. It's that sort of feeling, and they have no cute scenes together, not even, they have one kiss scene when they do some magic stuff together, and then they both kind of freak out about it, and it's just wow, that was random. Before this, he could hardly stand your guts, and you also could hardly stand his guts, and now you guys are like, but maybe I want to hit that. And it doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel like they have chemistry. It feels very forced, like that's the formula, so she has to fall in love with this dude, when she has so much more chemistry with her best friend Kasia. So, now that we've talked about the bad romance, let's talk about Kasia and how awesome she is, because she has stuff happen in the spoilery parts of the book that I can't describe, but she turns into a cool person, and I just want you to know that. Like, she just ends up being super cool, and, like, I can't tell you why, but she does, and you just have to believe me. So yeah, Kasia is really cool, and then our main characters, the dragon and Angie, are also kind of cool, but, like, they seem very one-dimensional. They have, like, very specific traits that are just used over and over again in the book. For the dragon, it's the fact that he's analytical and he's cold and reserved, and, like, that's his shtick. And he doesn't really end up outside of that shtick. Like, that's his thing, that's his personality, and that's his only personality. And because, I think it suffers because he's out of the book for a good half of it, he just doesn't get any development beyond that. Like, you're usually supposed to crack into that kind of character and discover the fluffy insides that make him lovable, but he just doesn't get that development because there's no time with him to do so. They're so busy doing the main quest and leaving him behind the entire time the main quest is going on. So, yeah, he's fine, like, he's a functional character, but he doesn't have a lot of development, and you can't really love him because there's not much to him. Angie is a bit of a kind of typical, not your everyday girl. She's a little bit more dirty. She likes to, like, climb trees and go in the woods, and the way she thinks is more rebellious and all that kind of stuff. She doesn't surprise me as being one of the protagonists that get kidnapped, but something special about them makes them the survivor or whatever. I'm not like, she doesn't defy expectations in that manner. I will say she is a strong character in that she definitely pushes the story forward in her own way. She isn't waiting on other people to tell her what to do and then just moving from point A to point B so that other characters can take the spotlight. She is actively pushing forward her own plot, which is nice to see because that definitely can be a symptom in some of these more fairy tale-esque stories. It's just like, oh, the character's being led along their quest by various other characters, usually the male lead being like, oh, I've got this dark and edgy thing to do. That's not the case here. She's very much pushing forward to try to defeat the evil, trying to save her friends and family and all that kind of stuff, actively trying to practice and use her new magic skills that she learned. So she's very strong and present in her story. So it's not a bad thing, but it's just nothing super exciting where I'd remember her above any other female protagonist in a young adult novel. So, that's basically it for my non-spoiler section, but I do have one last thing to say before I get to the full review, and I definitely want to say this here because it is a bit of a touchy subject, and that is that there is a weird, like, 2-line thing that is indicative of really bad writing here that I don't understand, but I feel like I need to talk about it. And that is that there's this one character who is described as actively being of African descent. Even in this mystical world that doesn't have Africa, this character is the, dark-skinned, dreaded-haired character in all of these fantasy series that has to be explicitly different from every character. And she comes from a foreign land. And she's awesome as a fighter and a wizard, but for some reason the author feels the need to have a little bit of a blurb of their backstory, which is that her parents came to this country as slaves. And she broke out of slavery, and that's why she's a wizard. And that's a bit problematic, if you haven't noticed, because nowhere in this story was that important. It wasn't important that the one black character be a slave. That there's no other slaves in the story. The country she comes from is not mentioned ever again in the entire book. And her as her own character never has anything to do with like her former slave owners or her family, or even like the rest of her family at all. Like none of them are here except for one great-grandson. So like it's a moot point. It wasn't important information to know. It doesn't impact the story at all. It's just there so you know that the one black character was part of slavery. And that's so... I don't jive with that. I don't think that's a good technique. I don't think that's a good storytelling, bit. I just think that that's kind of stupid that you have to put that in there. And really, during the editing process, I'm kind of confused as to why someone didn't say, can't we just edit these 2 lines out? Because it changes nothing to know that she's just a wizard. If she's just left as a wizard, it's fine. Nothing in the story changes at all. But it's just so random that they just were oh yeah, and also in this magical, mystical world where we're fighting a forest that has sentience, we also have slavery. And it's a thing for now. But we're never going to talk about it again. It's never going to show up ever again. I could go on a whole rant video about why that just ticked me off and was so problematic, but I definitely felt like I needed to share that in the non-spoiler section so that everyone who is about to read this could understand that that's in here. And I'm going to try to grade it regardless because it's such a small part of the book, but I acknowledge that it's there and it is problematic and it's not something I endorse, but I'm trying to keep it separate from 98% of the rest of the story because the rest of the story had its good moments and I don't feel like they deserve to be, the whole story itself deserves to be dragged down by the fact that the author had a 2-sentence racist moment. That's up to you though. Where your line on that is your deal. So I put that information out there for you. Maybe that ruins the entire book for you. I don't know. But at least you know it's there. And we can move past it. So Uprooted. Overall, I think it's a decent book. I think it's a good, just fairy tale fantasy-esque book. It takes you places you're not thoroughly expecting to go, but it doesn't capitalize on any of its ideas to where you're really entranced and engrossed in this story. The world isn't unique enough where you're oh, I definitely can tell this apart from any other fantasy world, but it's also not generic enough where you're bored and you're kind of predicting everything that's going to follow. It's got a good section of little mini dramas, and the things that poor Angie has to go through really do seem not traumatic, but they do seem difficult, and it is a mini game of chess between Angie and the evil forces at work. So it is kind of fun to see that back and forth. It's just that this book, it starts so many ideas and gets halfway through to really capitalizing on them and then just doesn't. From the romance to certain sections of the plot to certain character developments, it's just kind of average along the full scale of it. So with that in mind, I'm going to give this book a tentative 3.5 stars out of 5. I feel it's perfectly serviceable, and if it's the stuff you like, you're probably going to enjoy it, but it's just not enough for me. I wanted the characters to be a little bit more well thought out. I wanted the romance to be a little stronger. I wanted the plot to be a little bit more cohesive, and the mysteries and the twists to be a little bit more well thought out and integrated into the whole story so that they were more of a twist rather than just a, oh, I guess that's a thing now kind of feel. but not a bad read. I wasn't bored reading it, and I did want to finish it to the end. I was enjoying it. So, yeah, 3.5 stars pretty much fits my mood for this book. So that's the non-spoiler section. We're about to hit intermission, but before you go, thank you so much for watching if you're about to leave and skip the spoiler section. The next book I'm reading is To Kill a Kingdom, which is a book that is basically like every other book I've read for book review, a fantasy story, but this time with mermaids. So look forward to that book review. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys after the intermission or in the next episode. Bye-bye! Hello there, and welcome to the spoiler section, where we get to talk about all the details in this fine book. This fine, kinda mediocre book. The first thing I want to talk about is basically the romance in greater detail, because it does something that's really weird that I feel like I have to capitalize on, which is the fact that the freaking love interest leaves for half the book. So the first part of the book is heavily occupied with putting the dragon and Angie together and just mixing around with those personalities. And you think that would build to a romance, but it doesn't. They start trying to do an enemies to lovers thing where he's the evil wizard who kidnapped her, basically. She's the victim, and they have, like, very different personalities. He's very strict and analytical. She's very just go with the flow. And they butt heads a lot on a lot of different subjects. They just do not get along. And then when Angie suddenly discovers her knack for magic and, goes and saves Cassia. So when she comes and saves her friend Cassia from being tree food, she basically discovers her powers and, like, the true extent of how her magic can be. And then that's when her and the dragon kind of connect more on I'm actually going to try to learn magic level, especially to save Cassia even further from being tree food, but brainless tree food. The trees eat a lot of people in this book, so I guess they're all tree food in a way. So the romance from that point on, it should move better. It should get from the enemies to the lovers quite organically, but instead they only have one kiss scene and then one sex scene at the very end of the book, and that's kind of the extent of the rest of the relationship. They learn from each other, and they kind of get to a point where they, like, begrudgingly respect one another as magic users, but there's, like, they meld magic a little bit for one scene, then they spontaneously kiss, and then that's it. They give up on any romance in this story at all, and Angie goes to a whole nother section of the country. She becomes a wizard over at wizard school thing, group, stuff. And the dragon stays behind to do normal foresty dragon things, like, making sure the tree food doesn't become the tree food too fast. So they just kind of not talk for most of the middle of the story, which is kind of the meat of the story and where we actually start to learn things about this world and about the true enemy, which is the forest. And we don't even have one of our main protagonists there. And then they get to the end and you think, they're gonna have a heartfelt, warm reunion. And they sort of, but it's more just like, how'd you get here? We're having a war. I brought more soldiers behind me, so, like, double the war thing. And then they're too busy preparing to fight. Boom, sex scene, because, I don't know, comfort thing before death or something. And then that's it. The rest of the story, they just solve their problems. Obviously, like, fighting the enemy and all that. And then at the very end, they live separately, basically, for a while, and then eventually the dragon kind of comes over and is like, hey, maybe I'm willing to give this relationship thing a chance, because apparently part of his character was that he just doesn't bond well with people, and he doesn't, connect well which, like, you kind of got a feeling of because he was just cold and aloof. But, like, the deep-seated trauma part of it was very much lacking. Like, oh, he doesn't want to make connections with anyone. He doesn't want to feel with anyone. And it's just like, where are you getting that? Because this guy has had no character arc this entire story. He's just been the guy who knows stuff and looks young enough that he can be a love interest. But the only people who really develop in this story are Angie and Cassia. And potentially the prince. Merrick. The prince named Merrick. I totally did not just forget his name right now. But where the romance sucks, Cassia shines because she just comes out of the woodwork. Woodwork. She literally comes out of the woodwork being a demi-human, like part wood, part human, and so she just becomes this great kick-butt warrior girl. She hasn't trained to be a warrior. She isn't someone who was born, holding a sword and training in the backyard with it or doing any sort of like physical labor. She was just basically a glorified housewife in training. And then she gets kidnapped by this tree, learns that she has like superhuman durability and strength now, and she's very careful about it. She's very cognizant that she's changed. And so she just starts protecting people and is like, hey, I'm gonna just beat the crap out of people. There's 2 children who lose their parents very quickly, and so she takes them under her wing. So the 2 children from the first prince and his wife, like, they join them towards the very end. They're not very important at all, but it just shows that Cassia just kicks more butt, because then she picks up a sword and is just like, alright, time to just crack some skulls and just go for it. She even gets the sword, the legendary sword the one wizard lady is working on for years to take down the forest, and she's just like, alright, I'll go after the lady, I'll kill her, sure. I'm a warrior now. And it totally, like, you just kind of get it. She's just kind of evolved past her basic need as in, like, background character or as a plot device to, like, put Angie's story forward. And she becomes her own character that's just like, no, I'm not gonna sit in the background and just, like, cry and, like, wish for good things. I got new beefy powers, so I'm just gonna go out and kick some tail. So yeah, I really liked Cassia. I really liked that she wasn't just a background character. I liked that she took a traditional role that would be played by a best friend, and then went even further with that and actually developed into her own character. Like, her and Angie had a lot more chemistry than the freaking dragon and Angie, so I kind of just want a sequel or a spin-off that would just be Angie and Cassia exploring this world and being like, alright, I'm a witch who has ultimate powers, and I am a half-tree person, curse person? I'm like a were-tree. I'm a were-tree who kicks butt, and we have these 2 children that just follow along. Let's go do stuff together. That sounds like a better plot than what this was, quite honestly. And not for lack of trying, but just like, it feels more fulfilling to have them just have more fun, those 2 characters. The rest of the characters in this book were, like, fine. But, like, that's the extent of it. They were just fine. Including the dragon, who's supposed to be our main, like, male lead and our love interest. He's just so kind of boring. I really enjoyed Cassia, and I enjoyed her whole character arc and her interactions with Angie. Like, that part was great. I love that part of the book. The last thing I want to talk about in the spoilers section is the villain, because I feel like the villain is one of those creative aspects of this story that's really fun conceptually and for most of the story, but the ending kind of sucks for the villain and our heroes. And because of how creative and awesome this villain was, it just felt more disappointing when it turned out that they just had a very non-violent, generic finish for them. So the villain is technically it's the forest, but if you, like, want to get even more specific, it's a specific druidic, I'm using the word druid, they're not necessarily a druid, but a wood-like creature princess who gets married to a king way back when, and then gets betrayed by the rest of the humans once the king dies, and they go try to kill her family, or like her tree family, and so she gets super sad and then becomes evil, takes over, and starts bringing people into the forest to turn them into trees, to grow this cursed forest that will, like, eat humans alive. It's a very, very creative, very fun villain. The forest itself is the creative part. The part that isn't creative is that, oh, she's a woman scorned. That's just really basic stuff right there. And it kind of makes me sad that this supernatural, super smart forest that has been like 3 steps ahead planning everything else in this book is just an old queen who was scorned by humanity. And that makes it seem like, oh, it's secretly an environmental message or something, like it's trying to say something else really simple, but it's just really boring. Like, you have giant praying mantis monsters that are just eating the heads off of horses, and you have a book that was created by a guy who went mad via, like, forest madness that literally turns people who read it into monsters that have never existed before, like into new monsters, you know, that no one has ever dealt with. And your main villain, the one behind all of that, is a woman who's got screwed over by trusted compatriots in a monarchy setting. It's not a bad, like, premise. It's not a bad backstory for a villain, but it's just one that's so uncreative, because I've seen that, and, like, it's, like, kind of like, yeah, I can kind of sympathize with her, but especially in the context of, like, what has happened in the story, how many people have died, how many, like, years this forest has just grown and terrorized people. It's caused a war with the neighboring countries to continue on beyond when they were going to make peace talks, because it, like, set people up with this, like, crazed madness to kill each other, like, for the benefit of the forest to come in and kill them all afterwards. And, like, people have been, like, they're trapped in these tree prisons where their brains just, like, rot in a metaphysical space that looks like the forest, where they think they're lost and they're scared, and, like, just all hope is lost for, like, hundreds or tens of years at least. Like, the queen was in there for at least 20 or something. And so, like, these are awful things on a way bigger scale than just, yeah, I got trapped underground by my husband's, like, most trusted advisors. And, like, when I came out, my family was dead. Or they were trying to kill my family. And it's like, yeah, that's bad. Don't get me wrong. That is bad. But it's just a different level. And so when the solution to this whole villain problem is that the main character goes in, sees all this backstory, and then kind of helps her peacefully pass on. You know, like, she's still dead, but it's not like she, like, kills that creature. She just lets her peacefully pass on with her sister, druid tree person. It just feels so anticlimactic. Like, this thing was actively, it had possessed a queen so that she would behead her own subjects and, like, other soldiers in her way in such a manner that, like, everyone on the battlefield was talking about, like, an angel that came from heaven and just, like, was smiting people, and blood was running all over the ground, and no one could stop her, and she was invulnerable to everything, and everyone was like, oh my god, this is like a heavenly event is happening right now with this woman. That level of evil / like, power and violence was involved in this druid person's plan to murder everyone. And you solved it non-violently because we have to learn a lesson, I'm guessing, is the point. Something environmentalism, something magic, fantasy, fairy stuff. But, like, it just doesn't feel worth it. It just doesn't feel like that's, like, what we were building up to. We have this cool sword that was supposed to be the only thing that could kill this lady. And you used it, and she didn't die. And so you went to her home, to the center tree that started it all. And then you're almost dying. And you just kind of send her to sleep. Like, she dies, I guess. But, like, not really. It's like a really odd kind of death thing, you know, when people can die, but they also become trees and they're still alive, you know. A weird mix of are they dead or are they not. It wasn't bad, which is the tough part, because I don't want to just come out and say, like, oh, I didn't like it, so therefore it was awful, because that's not how the world works, and that's not how writing works. I can think something should have gone a different way, and it still be good writing, just, like, not where I wanted the plot to go. And in this case, I think that's what this is. I think it's fine as an ending, and it can work for people who read this and maybe, like, they really loved it, they really loved the story and the fantasy world and whatever. But for me, like, that ending just wasn't worth all the stuff before. All the stuff before was so fun, and it was so interesting and intriguing, and much like the romance, where it starts off fun and interesting, it just sputters out instead of really finishing on a high note. And yeah, that's the symptom that this book has in general. Is just, it has a lot of fun things that it starts really strong with. The magic system starts off really strong. The characters, they have really good starts. The villain has a good start. All the action and the intrigue and all the steps in the Forest's evil plot, all of those start off so strong. And then you just kind of get to the end in the middle of those pieces, and it just doesn't hold out. Like, it just stays at the original where it was starting. But you need to escalate throughout the story. I don't know. Maybe I drew a graph and I just, like, placed it over my face at this point that, like, tries to represent how I feel how I feel all of this went. If I were to graph it, it'd look like this. But yeah, I don't know. I guess that's why I feel like this is a 3.5 star instead of like 5 out of 5. Is just, you know, it sets expectations a certain way, then it just doesn't accomplish those expectations. It's really hard to describe. Why does anyone review books? How can anyone describe anything about a book? It's words. Does this have words? It has words. Do the words make sense? The words make sense. Are the words fun? The words are fun. But do I feel whole at the end of it? No. So now that that's out of the way, that totally normal and totally comprehensible rambling of a not crazed girl, that's where I'm going to leave the spoiler section, because I really don't have too much more to say. There wasn't too much that was going on in this story that, I don't know, that I felt really need diving into. I guess that's the, that's the curse of a book that's just kind of, good. It's just that there's not a lot to say. There's not a lot to really dive into with this book. So yeah, that's Naomi Novick's Uprooted. So next time I'm going to read and review To Kill a Kingdom, which, to remind you, is basically my usual fantasy shtick, but instead of being on land, it is at sea. What variety we have here at the FallenGale channel. I don't want you to miss it. So be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to this video so that you can see when we talk about the sirens and how they totally should have won the Siren-Human War. 100% that's actually part of the plot is there's a war between sirens and, like, people on land, and I'm, like, psyched to see where that goes, because I want some siren-human killing action, like battles in the ocean. I want people to be coming out of the water and, like, dragging people under and, like, drowning them. Like, It's gonna be. I'm excited to see what happens in this book. So I'll read this and review it next time on Gale's Book Review. Bye-bye!
Hi there, it's the end of the video, my friend. Hit the bell if it was okay, I'm sure I'll make good content someday. I'll play some games or do some drawing, Pokemon and fights with darling, video essays and reviews. I couldn't do it without you, so thanks, like and subscribe.